Hi there, I'm Kevin Turner from Spanish River High School in Boca Raton, Florida, and we are back with AP Daily. This is topic 7.2, Economic Sectors and Patterns, video 1. So what are we going to learn in this particular video? So this topic really deals with kind of just one key idea, and that is that we can classify the sectors of the economy, just like you might classify chemicals by metals or gases, and you might classify in biology. We classify economic sectors based on what the job entails. And what we're going to see is that primary activities, those that kind of humans did first, are going to be the things that are going to be extracting things from the earth. It's agriculture, it's fishing, it's forestry, anything that is minerals, raw materials, pulling it out of the earth, pulling it out of the water. Those are all going to be classified as primary activities. Now that you have that raw material, what will happen second? Secondary is going to be the processing, the manufacturing, right? The industry that takes those raw materials and then turns them into usable products that we would want to buy, right? So that's going to be the secondary level of the economy. And then third, the tertiary level is going to be the actual services that are being provided that utilize all of the products that have been made at that secondary level. And when we say services, these are going to be, again, the soft skills, basically the people who interact with us, the people who use knowledge, right? And they're not necessarily making something, but they're providing a service for us. Now, the tertiary level in the modern world has been refined to also include some very special kinds of services. And the first of these is quaternary. All right, obviously the fourth level. And I always think of a quarter as being 1/4 of a dollar. That's the easy way to kind of remember this. And there's 4 letters I want you to really commit to memory here: finance, insurance, and real estate. FIRE. These kinds of jobs, anything that's dealing with what I call OPM, other people's money, especially, is going to be a quaternary level of service. So it's a special kind of tertiary, and we call it this quaternary level. Sometimes you'll see publications, they'll only list primary, secondary, tertiary. Sometimes you'll see a quaternary level as well. So that fifth stage is the quinary level of employment. And this is going to be anyone who has a decision-making capability. It's going to be leadership, executives, people who are involved in government, right? Anything that is at that high level of administration is going to be a quinary level of the employment. Now, there's an unwritten rule that, incomes go up when you go from primary to secondary to tertiary to quaternary. That's generally true. Remember, we deal with a lot of generalizations in human geography. So just be aware that that may not always be true, but generally speaking, as a country goes through levels of development, you're going to see that the employment in sectors is going to shift out of primary into the secondary, then into the tertiary, quaternary, as a country becomes wealthier. So let's look at some examples. And we have this fantastic map, right, that's been animated for us. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you that if you were to look at the world through a regional, all right, scale of analysis, right, we've got this world map, but remember, we're going to look at this by country data, right? We see that countries like Democratic Republic of Congo, a lot of rare earths, a lot of mining. The Philippines, very famous for fishing. In Brazil, forestry, right? The lumber that comes out of the rainforest. We can see that these areas of the world are very, very heavily engaged in the primary sector of employment. Now, when we start thinking about factories, everybody sees, oh, made in China. We know that a lot of our, gadgets and, things like the smartphones, but also think about clothing. Bangladesh is one of the largest countries in the world in terms of output of manufactured clothing items. Mexico making a lot of cars. A lot of U.S. car companies have shifted operations into Mexico, taking advantage of cheap labor, particularly as part of that United States-Mexico-Canada agreement, the successor to the old NAFTA free trade agreement. And then we think about tertiary. All of your bigger, richer economies of the world are heavily dominated in the service sector. Something like 2/3 of the US economy is based on service sector employment. So you see this in Europe, you're going to see this in the US and Canada. To some degree, you'll see it in all of the richer countries of the world. And when we think about quaternary, and especially when we think about quinary levels of work, we're going to see that the major headquarters, the front offices of companies, the accounting divisions of companies, these are going to be based in some of the largest cities of the world, in the tallest buildings, where they can network and control this vast array of their multinational corporations, right? So that's, a great geographical overview of how we see the layout of the primary, secondary, tertiary, quaternary, and quinary levels of employment, right? But remember, we can connect that to development. So let's practice. We can have a couple of MCQ items here. And this one's pretty straightforward. I mean, we basically, talked exactly about these kinds of jobs: economic activities that involve the extraction of natural resources, lumbering, fishing, mining, agriculture. What are those called? Now, clearly, we just talked about it. I'm sure you remember. The answer is that these are primary economic activities. But I think the lesson here that I want you to remember, since you and I haven't talked in a while since Unit 1, is that when we think about these MCQs, a lot of times some of the easier questions are going to be strongly vocabulary based. So maybe in your class, you create some Quizlets with your teacher and you work on some vocabulary type things, because these kinds of topic driven questions are going to be conceptualized like that, right? So pretty easy question. Then you see something like this: quaternary activities are those that. So now it's not just straight vocab, it's a little bit more of making a connection between the term and some kind of description of the activity, right? So we know primary, secondary, tertiary. Okay, quaternary, where are we going to get to? I told you that, remember, that's $0.25, and it's FIRE, right? Finance, insurance, and real estate. So what does finance, insurance, and real estate do? They process information. They collect information. They process information. These financial planners, right? The real estate agents, right? Anybody who's involved in managing massive amounts of money, they're going to be involved in the collection, the processing, and the manipulation of information. Look at all of your wrong answers. If you know your vocab, you can easily see, okay, A, that's primary. B, that's going to be secondary, right? If you think about D, that's your tertiary, right? And then E's just kind of wildly out there, right? They didn't even put anything quinary there, but clearly C is our correct answer. One more question for you. And this one is the one that's going to be a compare verb. And remember, if you look through your CED, you've got define and identify and describe and explain, and then you have this compare verb. So compared with more developed countries, which of the following statements is true of the less developed countries? Well, this goes back to like the map that we talked about, where we could see that there was a geographical, division of, primary and secondary and tertiary employment and beyond. So what do we know about the less developed economies of the world, right? So you look at your answer choices, and, E is, talking about fertility. That's a distractor there. Well, first of all, the less developed countries' fertility should be a little bit higher, not lower. So we know it's not that. The natural increase is lower. We know it wouldn't be lower. It'd be a little bit higher, even though there's a lot of improvement in those countries, in those categories, right? Per capita consumption of energy. No, because again, they're poor. So when you look at that, population pyramids are narrow. No, we know the base would be a little bit wider. We know that from Unit 2. And hopefully you watch some of those AP Daily videos. They were great. But we know that it's got to be A higher percentage of the labor force is engaged in food production, because that's at the primary level. And the least developed countries are going to be overwhelmingly primary, right? As a country becomes kind of that mid-level economy, a lot of secondary jobs, a lot of manufacturing. As a country becomes truly well off, you're going to see that the vast majority of people working in that economy are going to be tertiary and above. Okay, so what should we take away now that we've seen this video and talked about primary, secondary, tertiary, quaternary, quinary? Don't forget, not only is this class all about the topics, but we got to be able to marry the topics to the skills, right? And so in skill 2B, it talks about the idea of, explaining spatial relationships in a specified context or region. Now, I bolded that because that to me is the real pullout of that skill. They're going to give you actual places in the world. They're going to say fishing in the Philippines. They're going to say automotive manufacturing in Mexico. Or, I put a few things here, farming in India, tourism, right? Financial markets, executive decision-making, politicians, they're going to give you places in the world that you're going to have to understand that the skill is also important and not just the topics. You can't just study one or the other. You have to be able to combine both. Okay. Again, a fun idea you might do with your teacher in your class, and you could share this idea, is to practice some of these item writing activities, not responding to the FRQs. How about you guys try to create some FRQs, work on the A, B, C, D, E, F concepts and say, define, identify, describe, explain, compare, and use your vocabulary. Because if you can construct one of these free response questions, you're going to be a lot better at answering these free response questions. Until next time, thanks for watching AP Daily. Hi there, I'm Kevin Turner from Spanish River High School in Boca Raton, Florida, and we're back with another AP Daily video, this time topic 7.2, video 2, economic sectors and patterns. So you remember when I talked to you guys a lot in Unit 1, I said that, this class is all about patterns and processes. Well, the pattern's what you see, and the process is the explanation for that pattern. So when we think like a geographer, what are we going to learn? We're going to learn that we ask the question of where and why there and why should we care? So when we think about the patterns of today's globalized economy, they're shaped by the processes of labor costs, innovations in transportation, and these labor costs are going to be lower in areas of the world that we consider to be emerging economies, not the fully developed places like the United States, Europe, Japan. They're going to be the more emerging economies like a Brazil, like an India, like a China, like a Mexico. Those are going to be places where labor costs are less. So we're going to use a model that you have seen before, the core periphery arrangement. This is based on Wallerstein's world systems theory, where we're going to look at the core, the periphery, and the semi-periphery as it relates to these industrial locations in the global economy. And we know that in the modern world, these innovations in transportation have driven down costs. In fact, things have become almost disposable. When I was your age, and I know that seems like a long time ago, VCRs were very, very expensive. Now, they're almost throwaway when they don't work because they're so cheap, because the transportation costs have come down so much. Occasionally, instead of things only being shipped in one mode of transportation, like truck or train or by ship, there will have to be a break of bulk point, meaning take it off of a ship and put it on a train, or take it off of a train and put it on a truck. And this is where the story gets interesting, because about almost 100 years ago, there was an innovation in shipping and in transportation of products. Let's take a look at this example, right? Using these amazing animations, we can see that in the olden days, shipping would, a container ship would come into a port, and you would have manual labor. People would be going up and down the gangplanks, and there might have a few swinging pulleys and ropes, and they were unloading crates and barrels and boxes of all kinds of sizes, right? This took a long time. And one thing you need to remember when you think about the global economy, time is money. So the longer that ship sat there in port, it was costing money, because you got to get the product on the shelf if you want somebody to be able to buy it. So what happened? We have a big innovation, right? And it changes the idea of shipping into these massive container ships that you guys may have seen if you've ever been in a big port city. Right. And these ships now have containers that are standardized in size. They're about 53 feet long, and they can be picked up by these automated cranes. And look what's gone. All the human labor has kind of disappeared. And these cranes will pick up and drop these containers onto a train, onto a truck. It's the size of the tractor trailer that you see on the highway. It fits on a train car that you might see go down the tracks, and it fits onto these, and thousands of these containers on a ship. One of the funniest things ever in my class was when I was talking about this, a student said, well, that must not be good for the people that used to work down there at the port. And I don't know why, but I thought to myself, well, Tommy used to work on the docks, but the union's been on strike. He's down on his luck. It's tough. And the kid's writing it down. And somebody else said, isn't that the lyrics to Bon Jovi, Living on a Prayer? And by the way, it is. So when you think about containerization, it's great for us as customers. It's not necessarily great for the people whose job it was to unload and load the ship, right? Because now those ships can be unloaded and loaded in a matter of hours instead of a matter of days. So let's practice some questions that have to do with this idea of the global network of trade, right? The early stages of the core periphery model, right? What does it describe? Remember, describe is one of those 5 verbs you're always going to see in our question stems, okay? So the core periphery model talks about countries that are core are more economically developed. Countries that are peripheral are less economically developed. The semi-periphery ones are the ones that are kind of in the middle. They're neither rich nor poor, right? So when we think about it, we see that, you know, some of these answers are really good. We got some parallelisms. A couple of them say the word relationship, right? And this topic has skill 2B as its skill. And remember, skill 2B, if you watched video 1, is all about relationships in a specified context. So our answer for this one is the relationship of power and the transfer of resources from the less developed countries to the more developed countries, right? If you remember in video 1, we talked about primary, secondary, tertiary, quaternary, quinary. So the resources and the raw materials from the lesser developed countries are being shifted into the richer areas of the world in the form of manufactured goods and products. Okay, the second question, environmental laws, labor availability, and access to markets are all major factors that affect which of the following, right? Well, we know that the topic that we're dealing with in this question is all about the global economy, right? Now, transportation's a great distractor down there. But remember, transportation costs are affected by distance and they're affected by the mode of transportation and all that. So that's a good answer, but that doesn't answer the question that's being asked. Instead, what we're saying is if we say how many labor, what's the quantity of labor? How much are we going to have to pay for this? Is it going to be close to where I'm going to sell the product? Do I have, a clean, environmental laws sometimes add costs, right? So when you think about that, we're going to talk about manufacturing locations. Where do I want to build my factory? I want to build my factory in the area where it's going to be the cheapest to operate it. Okay. So these are some practice questions that have to do with that topic. Okay. So what are we going to take away out of what we've learned here? The AP Human Geography course, which by now you've seen so many great videos from many of my colleagues and friends. There's so much about our class that spirals through Unit 1, Unit 2, Unit 3, Unit 4, Unit 5, Unit 6, Unit 7 now, right? So we know that the core periphery model is something that we're going to come back to over and over and over again. And you're going to utilize it as something that is really helpful in a lot of different ways. You could talk in Unit 3 about cultural geography, and you could say, okay, the core of the Francophone society, the Quebecois people in Canada, that's going to be in the province of Quebec. Whereas the farther you get from that core area, the less French you're going to hear. It becomes more peripheral. You could talk about in the United States that core areas of the United States, the urban areas, they tend to vote left, whereas more rural areas tend to vote right. They're more conservative Republican. Urban areas tend to be more Democratic and liberal. So we could look at that as a core periphery arrangement as well. And you could talk about, for example, winemaking in California. The whole state will grow grapes to make wine. But if you talk about the core, right, Napa is world famous for that quality, even if they're not the most quantity of grapes grown, because it's actually a very small number, but it's this perceptual idea that that's the core area of winemaking in California, along with neighboring Sonoma County. We shouldn't leave them out. But the farther you get from that area, less known, right? Because Americans kind of, when they think wine, they think, oh, it's got to be Napa Valley. Okay. So remember, I said this earlier, skill 2B is all about those relationships in specified contexts. Look at what I did there. I gave you specified geographical spatial context for each of those kinds of topics. We talked about Quebec and French Canada. We talked about cities and rural areas in the United States. We talked about Napa County in California, right? Again, remember, our test is going to be topic based, but you got to have those skills. And remember, the course spirals all the way from Unit 1 out to Unit 7. Right? Until next time, thanks for watching AP Daily. Hi there, I'm Kevin Turner from Spanish River High School in Boca Raton, Florida, and we're back with another episode of AP Daily talking about economic sectors and patterns. So this is an interesting continuation from the last AP Daily video that I hope you watched. We were talking about global trade and especially transportation. So what are we going to learn today? We're going to look more specifically at a model, a theoretical construct that tells us about the optimum location for manufacturing locations. So in the agriculture unit, you're probably familiar with the Lord of the Rings, as we call him, Johann Heinrich von Thünen, and his model about agricultural location. If you have done the urban unit, you know, and anybody who's ever talked to me, Spatial Shark, they know that I love Kristalller's central place theory and those hexagons, right? But what we're going to do is we're going to look at a guy named Alfred Weber, and we're going to look at his least cost theory. He does for industry what von Thünen did for agriculture, what Kristaller did for services. And the overriding factor that Weber considered was transportation. Okay. Now, the other models, they were very generalized. One big difference, and if they ever ask you to compare models, remember you're talking about both similarities and differences if they do that. Their models were, kind of an area, and Weber's model, I should say, is a specific point. It is a very, very locational analysis. It's often shown using triangles. Right. And the points of the triangle will represent where the raw materials are coming from. And then the third point of the triangle, in a very simplified context, will be the market where the raw materials will be made into a product and then sold in that marketplace. And the theory goes that wherever the cheapest location to put those raw materials together into a finished product and then ship it to the market, that's where you will choose to locate your factory. And again, transportation costs were his prime concern. So basically, what we can see is that an activity is either going to be material oriented if it's closer to the raw materials, or it's going to be market oriented if it's closer to where you're going to sell it. And we have other words that we can use to describe those concepts. If it's material oriented, that means that the raw material is so big and so heavy, I don't really want to move that. But as I process it, it gets lighter, it gets smaller, and it gets cheaper to move it. And so that's what we call bulk reducing, right? And if it's market oriented, we know that as I put the product together, it's getting bigger, bulkier, heavier. By the way, it doesn't just have to be size or weight. It can also be volume, right? If it's market oriented, we say that it's bulk gaining. Right. And of course, I always hope to be bulk reducing in my personal life, but sadly, I tend to be bulk gaining. But this is what you have to remember when you think of the model. So Weber also considers, in addition to transportation, right, the idea of labor costs, and then the idea that factories may cluster together to share some of these costs. They call that agglomeration. And a really important thing to remember is that agglomeration is AKA clustering. Almost always, you're going to see that wherever the word agglomeration appears, the word clustering is usually going to be somewhere close by. And that's a great little test taking strategy, because you should know vocabulary that, agglomeration is clustering. So if you see clustering in the stem, look for agglomeration in the answers. It's usually going to be married together, those two terms. Okay, so let's take a look at some examples. And I picked one that has been on the AP exam in the past. There was a question about ethanol, the manufacturing of ethanol, which nowadays, if you've been to the gas pump, and some of you might even be old enough to drive now, you can see that sticker that 10% of our gas is now ethanol based. right? And we make that out of corn primarily. There are some other types of ethanol that can be manufactured from things like sugarcane. Brazil's really big into that. In Florida near me, they're talking about making it out of old citrus pulp and things like that. But any kind of biofuel, right? Because bio, life science, right? But any kind of living thing, that a plant-based, we can actually take that and break it down and derive energy out of it. And in case of corn, they generally make, millions and millions of pounds of corn will make, gallons and gallons of ethanol. And if you look at this picture, this is an ethanol plant in Iowa, and you can see the railway off to the right side there. Look at all those tanker cars, right? So what'll happen is the corn will be, delivered to the plant, and they'll process it, turn it into the fluid, into the liquid, and then they ship it out via the train cars all over the country. Now, why Iowa? Right? If you remember back in Unit 5, talking about the location of different crops in America, you know that those states that begin in the letter I, Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, particularly in Iowa, they've got the corn, tremendous acreage of corn, not just measuring it in acreages, measuring it in square miles of farms of corn. And if corn is your raw material to make the ethanol, and if you put the factory right on top of the corn, basically, what does that mean? This is raw material oriented because they're shipping the finished product hundreds of miles away to the big cities of the East Coast and the West Coast, where you and I are pumping this into the gas tanks of our cars. Okay. So let's practice. What would be the most profitable location for an ethanol manufacturing plant that converts corn into alcohol for use as an additive for gasoline? Gee, why do you think that Mr. Turner picked this question for this AP Daily video? It's exactly what I just told you. So when you think about reading in your book, when you think about watching these AP Daily videos, when you think about talking to your teacher in your classroom about these concepts, about the topics and the skills, this is what we're trying to get you to understand, is that a lot of this class is kind of AP common sense, right? If you know the vocabulary, if you really focus on acquiring this knowledge, you're going to do a great job on this AP exam. We know that you're working hard, right? You wouldn't be watching these videos if you didn't want to do well. So what's the most profitable location? You don't want to move the corn because it's big and heavy. You'd rather move the ethanol because it's going to be concentrated in the liquid form, and therefore it's going to be cheaper to ship it after you process it. So our answer is going to be, we want to put that factory near the prime corn producing area to minimize the transportation cost of the raw materials. This is a bulk reducing activity. Okay, let's go to this question. The reason for the concentration of copper smelters, refineries, and foundries. Now, those are big words. Sometimes, especially if you're a freshman taking this class, sometimes those kids will say, well, what's smelting and what's refining and what's a foundry? Basically, this is when they're processing the metal, right? So if you take copper out of the ground, we use copper all the times in things like wiring, in electronics. Copper is it's a conduit, right? It's going to allow the flow of electrical current. So when we think about this, you take out huge amounts of copper and then you have to process it into these smaller things, right? So why are we going to put these close to the copper mines? Again, we don't want to move the copper. We'd rather move the copper wire that's been put into bundles, and they make it into these big, huge, circular bundles. So what do we know? It's got to be a bulk reducing industry. That's why it's going to be right next to the raw materials. So what's something that might be bulk gaining, something that's going to get bigger? That would be something like automotive manufacturing, where you take a lot of little pieces and parts and then you make a big, heavy car. This is why you see a lot of German, Japanese, and Korean car companies. They don't want to make cars overseas and ship them to America. Hey, fun fact, we buy the most cars of anybody in the world. So what you're seeing is that these car companies are building cars in the United States. So, is it really a Japanese car if it's made in Tennessee? This is what's happening because they see that the cost is a lot cheaper if they make a bulk gaining item closer to the market where it's going to be bought. Okay, so what should we take away from this video? Remember that models and theories are just that. They're theoretical. They're hypothetical. So we should always remember that the models and theories we talk about in this class, they're not going to hold true in every single circumstance, but generally speaking, they're going to be true. So while industrialization has improved the standard of living for many people around the world, it's also contributed to the unequal geographical division of development, right? We can't really ignore that. So coming up in topic 7.3, you're going to see my friend Ms. Cosgrove from Miami, and she's going to walk you through some of the ways we can use kind of like a yardstick to measure development. Until then,